On the last day of 1775, amid a snowstorm that blanketed Quebec in white, the American forces entered a battle they could not afford to lose. After months of exhausting marches, after hunger, sickness, and roads that seemed almost impossible to survive, only one objective remained before them. They had to take Quebec, or accept that the entire invasion of Canada would collapse in that very winter. This was no longer just another advance in the campaign, it was the decisive blow. If the city fell, the northern gateway of the British Empire in North America would be violently shaken. If it held, the entire effort of the American rebels would be stopped just short of the final threshold. Quebec was an extraordinarily difficult target to swallow. The city stood on a high rocky promontory overlooking the St. Lawrence River. The upper town was shielded by walls and artillery, while the lower town was squeezed between cliff and water. Its narrow, twisting streets easily turned into killing grounds if an attacking force was brought to a halt. General Guy Carleton, commanding the defense, had no need to recklessly march out and fight a grand battle on open ground. He understood that his greatest advantage lay in Quebec's terrain itself. As long as he held the gates, sealed the narrow approaches into the lower town, and placed troops at the points the enemy had no choice but to pass through, the Americans would be forced to hurl themselves into a deadly maze of darkness, cold, and stone. Inside the city, the defenders loyal to the Crown consisted of British regulars, local militia, sailors, and Highland units under Alan Maclean. They were not an enormous army, but they had enough men to guard the critical positions. Every narrow stretch of road, every barricade, every crucial turn in the lower town could be turned into a pocket of concentrated fire. Outside the walls, the Americans under Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold were in the opposite position. They had already endured too much before even reaching Quebec. Arnold's force had crossed the Maine wilderness in a brutal march and arrived in a condition of rags and exhaustion. Montgomery's troops were somewhat better off, but the entire American force outside the city was weakening from cold, shortages, expiring enlistments, and a siege that had failed to force Quebec to open its gates. The longer they waited, the weaker they became, so they had to attack. The American plan was bold but fragile. They did not intend to strike head-on at the strongest defenses above. Instead, they chose to attack the lower town, which appeared more vulnerable if approached by surprise in the night. Montgomery would command the southern column, moving along the edge of the steep. Lawrence from the direction of Wolfe's Cove, circling beneath Cap Diamond and storming into the lower town from the south. Arnold would lead the northern column from near the St. Charles River and the Palace Gate, slipping along the narrow strip beneath the walls and driving down toward Sault-au-Matelot. Meanwhile, other units would open fire and create disturbances above, drawing the defenders' attention to the gates and ramparts of the upper town. If everything unfolded in perfect rhythm, the British would be distracted above while the two American columns slipped into the lower town from both ends, met inside, and opened the way to seize the entire lower section of the city. But the whole plan depended on one thing alone. The two attacks had to strike at the same time. If one column was delayed or broken too early, the other would be left to hurl itself alone against a city that was already awake. On the night of December 30 into the early hours of December 30, 1775, a snowstorm swept over Quebec. For the Americans, it was both an opportunity and a threat. The thick curtain of snow and the driving wind could conceal their movement, swallow their noise, and make sentries struggle to see. But that same weather also threw formations into confusion. Blurred signals made it difficult to keep powder dry, turned the roads slippery, and made communication between columns dangerously fragile. Even so, Montgomery and Arnold had to move. They no longer had the time to wait for better conditions. The feinting detachments moved into position first, preparing to fire on the gates above. Meanwhile, the two main columns began to move silently through the darkness. Montgomery led the southern force along an extremely narrow road between the cliff and the frozen river. There was no room to deploy broadly. The men had to move in single file. Ahead of them were barricades and defensive works guarding the entrance to the lower town. Arnold on the northern side faced no easier task. His men had to slip beneath the walls, over slick ground, and through obstacles barely visible in the snowy night. On the map, the two attacking columns looked like pincers closing at once. But on the actual battlefield, in blinding wind and snow, even a delay of a few minutes was enough for the plan to begin cracking apart. Then the feinting gunfire began. Alarm bells rang out inside Quebec. The city was awake. The defenders rushed to their positions. The streets were sealed, and muskets and cannon were turned down toward the narrow approaches by the river. Even so, both American assault columns kept moving forward, because by then they had come too far to withdraw easily. On the southern side, Montgomery led the attack along the river's edge, urging his men to break through the first obstacle. The advance party cleared an outer barricade faster than expected, and for a moment the entire column behind them felt that the chance was still theirs. Montgomery immediately tried to use those few minutes to force his way into the next defensive position before the defenders could fully steady themselves. But just beyond that barrier, British troops and Canadian militia were already waiting inside a small work placed exactly where it could do the most damage. They did not fire early. They waited until the Americans had come close enough, packed tightly enough into the narrow road, and then unleashed a volley at point-blank range. The blow was devastating enough to almost cut the head off the entire American column. Richard Montgomery fell in that first volley, along with several officers and soldiers beside him. In such a constricted passage, the death of the commander was not just a moral shock. It threw the whole column into confusion. The men behind could not even clearly see what had happened. They only saw the front ranks collapse into smoke and snow. There was no room to spread out, no time to reorganize. Within minutes, the southern assault broke apart and was driven back. The disaster on the southern side happened so quickly that Arnold's northern column did not yet realize it was about to fight alone. In the north, Arnold was still pressing his men through the first obstacles and into the Sault-au-Matelot area. Just as he approached the main barrier, he was badly wounded in the leg and had to be carried to the rear. Command on the spot passed to Daniel Morgan. Morgan was stubborn and forceful. He did not stop. He pushed his men forward, drove back some of the forward defensive positions, and burst into part of the lower town. For a few minutes, this column even created the impression that it might still turn the battle through sheer attacking fury. But that was also the moment when Quebec's trap closed. The lower town was not a place where an infiltrating column could easily spread out and exploit a breakthrough. It was a maze of narrow streets, stone walls, storehouses, barricades, and intersecting lines of fire. Every step forward taken by the Americans was checked by a new obstacle. At the same time, Carleton realized that Montgomery's column no longer posed a threat. That allowed him to concentrate his full attention and reinforcements on the American force trapped under Arnold and Morgan. Militia, sailors, regulars, and Highland detachments were fed into the streets, corners, and choke points the Americans would have to pass if they wanted to advance any farther. Morgan and his men still fought fiercely. They tried to gather into groups, hold sections of street, and return fire through snow and smoke. But they lacked everything necessary to turn an initial penetration into real victory. They lacked the supporting southern column, lacked artillery to smash the next barricades, lacked space to deploy in strength, and lacked clear communication in the storm and darkness. Every time they tried to storm another line of defense, flanking fire from the streets ahead cut them down. The front and rear of the column gradually separated. Even the routes of withdrawal were no longer secure, because the defenders had begun sealing the paths the Americans had already passed through. From an attacking force trying to break through, the Americans in the lower town were quickly transformed into a mass of men trapped inside a tightening pocket of fire. They could not open the way ahead. They could not cleanly retreat behind. On both sides stood buildings, stone walls, and muzzles aimed at them. Carleton did not need a roaring grand counterattack. He only needed to tighten each knot, close each street, and let the enemy wear itself out in unfamiliar terrain. By the time daylight strengthened, the outcome was clear. Montgomery's southern column had been completely shattered. Arnold's northern force had been split apart, boxed in, and finally forced to surrender piecemeal. Daniel Morgan and many of his men fell into the hands of the defenders after fighting to the very limit. In just a few hours on the morning of December 30, 1775, the blow the Americans had staked as a finishing strike turned into a severe defeat. The snow beneath Quebec's walls was strewn with dead men, wounded men, and prisoners. Montgomery lay dead on the southern side. Arnold was wounded and removed from the front. The strongest assault force had been swallowed in the narrow streets of the lower town. Quebec had not merely held, it had also broken the momentum of the American invasion of Canada. That is where the true importance of this battle lies. It was not the largest battle of the war, nor one where tens of thousands fought over many days, but in a few short hours, the fate of an entire campaign was decided. Quebec's terrain, Carleton's patience, the narrow choke points, the brutal weather, and the loss of rhythm between the two American columns combined into a perfect defensive blow. After this battle, the Americans still remained outside the city for a time, but the real chance to take Quebec had died in that snowstorm-filled morning. And when Quebec stood firm, the gate to Canada slammed shut against the American invasion.